On September 23, 1994, 19 elementary school children from Millbrook County boarded a yellow school bus for what should have been a 2-hour field trip to the State Museum. The bus never arrived. The children never came home. 29 years later, a construction crew breaking ground for a shopping center discovered something impossible. The missing bus, buried 12 feet underground in what had once been farmland.
I'm Lucas, and this is Lost Files. We tell the stories that mainstream media ignores. The disappearances, the mysteries, the cases that deserve more attention. If you know a story that needs to be heard, drop it in the form linked below. And if this one stuck with you, subscribe and let me know your thoughts in the comments.
40 miles from where anyone had ever looked. Inside, they found 19 sets of child-sized remains still buckled into their seats. And something else. Something that made no sense at all. Carved into every window of that buried bus were hash marks, thousands of them methodically etched into the glass from the inside, as if the children had been counting for a very long time. Millbrook Elementary sits on the edge of what used to be tobacco country, where the mountains start their slow rise toward Tennessee. In 1994, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Farmers mostly, a few families who worked at the textile mill, children who walked to school on gravel roads and caught fireflies after supper. The school had 93 students total, kindergarten through 5th grade. 19 of them were in the combined 3rd and 4th grade class taught by Eleanor Hartley, who'd been at Millbrook for 16 years and knew every child's middle name, every parent's voice, every family's particular struggles. Mrs. Hartley was 42 that fall. A woman who kept a coffee mug full of pencils on her desk and a first aid kit in her bottom drawer. She'd grown up in Millbrook herself, graduated from the high school in 1970, married her high school sweetheart, lost him in a farming accident 3 years later, and poured all the maternal energy she'd been saving for her own children into other people's. The children loved her in the fierce, uncomplicated way that 8- and 9-year-olds love adults who see them clearly. She remembered birthdays. She stayed after school to help with multiplication tables. She brought hot chocolate on test days and kept a collection of paperback books for children who finished their work early. On September 23, 1994, Mrs. Hartley had been planning the State Museum field trip for 6 weeks. She'd arranged for the school bus, packed emergency medication for the 2 children who needed it, sent permission slips home twice, and called the museum 3 times to confirm their 11 a.m. arrival. She'd also made a list, written in her careful cursive handwriting, of every child who would be on that bus. The list was found in her desk drawer 29 years later, when investigators came to look through the school's old records. Next to each name, she'd written a small note to herself. Tommy Brennan, remember his inhaler, Cassie Morrison, gets carsick, Cedar up front, Marcus Webb, packed lunch, peanut allergy, little Beth Carlisle, afraid of elevators, use stairs, 19 children, 19 small observations, 19 lives reduced, eventually to names on a missing persons report that grew colder with each passing year. The children ranged in age from 8 to 10. They came from families that had lived in Millbrook County for generations, Brennans and Morrisons and Webbs and Carlisles, whose names were carved on headstones in the Methodist cemetery dating back to the 1890s. Children who knew which creek had the best swimming holes, which fields grew the sweetest corn, which houses had grandmothers who gave out full-size candy bars on Halloween. Tommy Brennan was 9, asthmatic, and fascinated by dinosaurs. His bedroom walls were covered with pictures he'd cut from National Geographic, Stegosaurus and Triceratops, and the massive, terrifying T-Rex that gave him nightmares, but that he couldn't stop looking at. He'd been excited about the museum trip for weeks, asking Mrs. Hartley every day if they would see real fossils, if they would see dinosaur bones, if maybe they might even see a T-Rex skeleton. Cassie Morrison was 8, the youngest in the class, with red hair that caught sunlight like copper wire and a gap between her front teeth that made her lisp slightly when she got excited. She was one of 4 children in a family where money was always tight, and the field trip was the first time she'd ever been more than 20 miles from home. She'd packed her lunch in a paper bag the night before and asked her mother 3 times if she was sure they could afford the $5 admission fee. Marcus Webb was 10, tall for his age, with dark skin and serious eyes and a way of listening that made adults forget he was a child. His grandmother had raised him after his mother moved to Charlotte for work, and every Sunday after church he helped her tend the garden behind their house on Sycamore Street. He was saving his allowance to buy her a Mother's Day present in May, 7 months away, but he was a planner. Little Beth Carlisle, everyone called her Little Beth to distinguish her from her teenage cousin, was 8 years old and weighed barely 50 pounds. She'd been born 6 weeks premature and had been small ever since, a fact that made her fearless in ways that terrified her parents. She climbed trees other children couldn't reach. She explored caves other children wouldn't enter. She was fascinated by the underground, root cellars, storm drains, the basement of the Methodist church where the ladies kept Christmas decorations. These were not statistics. They were children with favorite colors and secret fears, with lunch boxes decorated with cartoon characters and homework assignments tucked into backpacks. Children who fought with their siblings and lost their mittens and left their bikes in front yards overnight. Children whose parents kissed them goodbye on the morning of September 23, 1994, and expected to see them at dinner. The bus driver that day was Ray Kowalski, 54 years old, a Korean War veteran who'd been driving for Millbrook County Schools for 12 years. Ray was known for his patience with difficult children and his careful driving on mountain roads. He'd never had an accident, never had a complaint filed against him, never been late for a pickup or delivery. Ray lived alone in a trailer on his brother's land, spending his evenings tending a small vegetable garden and his weekends at the VFW Hall, playing poker with other veterans and drinking beer that tasted like memory. He was quiet, reliable, and utterly forgettable. The kind of man who did his job without drama and went home to solitude by choice. On the morning of September 23rd, Ray performed his usual pre-trip inspection of Bus 47, a 1988 International chassis with room for 48 passengers. He checked the tires, the oil, the brakes, the lights. He walked the interior looking for damage or debris. He filled out the inspection form in his methodical handwriting and filed it in the metal clipboard bolted to his dashboard. Bus 47 was painted the regulation yellow, marked with the school district name and the number 47 in black letters on the front and back. It had brown vinyl seats that stuck to bare legs in summer and smelled like disinfectant and childhood. That particular combination of pencil erasers and juice boxes and the industrial soap they used to mop the floors at Millbrook Elementary. Ray had driven this route hundreds of times, down the mountain from the school, through the valley on State Route 15, past the tobacco barns and farmhouses through the town of Cedar Falls, then onto the interstate that would take them to the state capitol and the museum where dinosaur skeletons waited in climate-controlled rooms. It was a clear September morning, the kind of day when summer finally lets go and autumn begins to seep into the mountains like water into stone. The leaves hadn't started changing yet, but there was something in the air, a coolness at the edges, a quality of light that suggested transformation was coming. Mrs. Hartley arrived at school at 7:15 a.m. as she did every morning. She unlocked her classroom, turned on the lights, and wrote the day's schedule on the blackboard in her careful cursive. Morning. Math quiz, multiplication tables 1 to 12, 10:30, load bus for museum trip 11 o'clock, arrive at State Museum 1 o'clock, lunch in museum cafeteria 3 o'clock, leave museum 4:30, expected return to school asterisk. She'd drawn a small dinosaur in chalk next to the schedule, a smiling brontosaurus that made her think of Tommy Brennan and his endless questions about creatures that had died millions of years before he was born. The children arrived as they always did, in clusters and pairs, some dropped off by parents in pickup trucks, others walking from houses within a few blocks of the school. They carried their usual backpacks, plus small paper sacks with field trip lunches prepared by parents who'd gotten up early to pack sandwiches and apples and juice boxes with cartoon characters on the side. Tommy Brennan's mother had driven him to school instead of letting him walk, and she'd whispered something to Mrs. Hartley about his inhaler before kissing him goodbye. Little Beth Carlisle had arrived with her cousin, who was in 5th grade and too old for the field trip, but young enough to be jealous. Marcus Webb walked to school alone, as he always did, carrying his lunch in a brown paper bag that his grandmother had marked with his name in careful block letters. The morning passed normally. Math quiz on multiplication tables, Mrs. Hartley walking between the rows of desks, watching pencils move across paper, occasionally stopping to whisper encouragement to a struggling student. Reading time, during which she read aloud from a book about a mouse who lived in a library, her voice carrying the rhythm of story while outside the windows, September sunlight slanted across empty playground equipment. At 10:25, Mrs. Hartley stood at the front of the classroom and clapped her hands twice. The signal her students knew meant attention immediately. All right, everyone, line up at the door. Remember what we talked about. Quiet voices on the bus, stay in your seats, and use your best manners at the museum. We're representing Millbrook Elementary today. 19, 8, and 9 and 10-year-olds shuffled into line, adjusting backpacks and checking pockets for lunch money and whispering about what they might see. Tommy Brennan bounced slightly on his toes, his inhaler tucked safely in his front pocket. Cassie Morrison held her lunch bag carefully, as if it contained something precious. Marcus Webb stood straight and still, already practicing the good behavior his grandmother had taught him was expected in public places. Mrs. Hartley counted heads, once, twice, 3 times, 19 children. She checked her clipboard, marked each name as present, and led the line down the hallway toward the main entrance where Bus 47 waited, engine running, exhaust visible in the crisp morning air. Principal Margaret Downey met them at the door, as she always did for field trips, checking her own list against Mrs. Hartley's and making sure every child had returned their permission slip. She was a solid woman in her 50s who'd been principal at Millbrook for 8 years, long enough to have taught some of these children's parents, long enough to know which families could afford field trips easily and which ones had scraped together the money because their children had begged. "Beautiful day for it," she told Mrs. Hartley, watching the children file toward the bus. "They'll love the museum. My own kids went there when they were this age." Ray Kowalski stood beside the bus door, greeting each child as they climbed the steps. He knew most of their names, had been driving some of them to and from school for years. He helped little Beth Carlisle up the high first step and reminded Tommy Brennan to sit near the front where Mrs. Hartley could keep an eye on his breathing. The children chose seats with the careful politics of elementary school social hierarchy. Best friends sitting together, shy children claiming spots near the teacher, the older 4th graders gravitating toward the back where they could whisper about things the 3rd graders weren't supposed to understand. Mrs. Hartley took her usual field trip seat, 3rd row back, on the right side, where she could see most of the bus and hear conversations that might need adult intervention. She counted heads one more time, checked her list, and nodded to Ray that everyone was accounted for. At exactly 10:30 a.m., Ray Kowalski shifted Bus 47 into drive and pulled away from Millbrook Elementary. In the side mirror, he could see Principal Downey waving from the front steps, and behind her the empty swing sets and monkey bars of the playground where these 19 children had spent their recesses, where they'd played tag and jumped rope and settled the small disputes that occupy the minds of 8 and 9-year-olds. The bus turned left onto Mountain View Road, beginning its descent toward the valley. Mrs. Hartley looked back once at the school, then turned her attention to her students, listening to their excited chatter about dinosaurs and mummies and the planetarium show they might see if they had time. Behind them, Millbrook Elementary grew smaller in the rear window, a modest brick building surrounded by mountains that had watched over children's dreams and fears for 63 years. In 4 hours, those same mountains would watch parents gather in the school parking lot, checking their watches, searching the horizon for a yellow bus that would never appear on that horizon again. But for now, in this moment, Bus 47 carried 19 children down the mountain toward wonder, toward an adventure that had begun like every other field trip in the history of Millbrook Elementary, with permission slips and bag lunches and a teacher who'd counted heads 3 times to make sure everyone was safe. The last person to see Bus 47 in normal circumstances was Geneva Hutchins, who owned a fruit stand at the junction of Mountain View Road and State Route 15. She was arranging apples in a display basket when the yellow school bus passed her stand at approximately 10:45 a.m., moving at a reasonable speed toward the valley floor. Geneva would later tell investigators that she'd waved at the bus as she always did when school groups passed her stand. She'd seen Mrs. Hartley's face in the third row window and thought she'd looked peaceful, prepared, the way teachers do when they're shepherding children toward education. She'd seen children's faces pressed against the windows, small hands waving back at her, voices she couldn't hear but could imagine, the bright chatter of kids on their way to somewhere special. One child near the back had held up what looked like a toy dinosaur, showing it to her as the bus passed. Geneva closed her fruit stand at 3 o'clock that afternoon, as she did every day. By then, Bus 47 should have been making its return trip, should have passed her stand again carrying tired, happy children home to parents who would ask about their day over dinner. The bus never passed her stand again. By 5:30 p.m., when the first frantic parent called Millbrook Elementary to ask why their child hadn't come home, Principal Downey was already on the phone with the State Museum trying to understand what had gone wrong. The museum had no record of the Millbrook Elementary field trip arriving. No one remembered seeing a school bus in the parking lot. The group was simply marked as no-show in the day's attendance records. At 6:15 p.m., Principal Downey called the state police. By 7 p.m., patrol cars were driving every possible route between Millbrook Elementary and the State Museum, searching for any sign of Bus 47. By 8 p.m., search helicopters were in the air, their spotlights sweeping across valleys and ridges where a school bus might have run off the road. By midnight, it was clear that 19 children, 1 teacher, and 1 bus driver had vanished somewhere between a fruit stand and a museum, somewhere along roads that dozens of people traveled every day, somewhere in broad daylight on a clear September afternoon. The disappearance made national news within 48 hours. CNN reporters set up equipment in the parking lot of Millbrook Elementary. Parents held candlelight vigils that were broadcast on networks across the country. The FBI established a command center in the school gymnasium, spreading maps across tables that had been used for 4th grade science projects just days before. Search teams combed every inch of the mountain roads between the school and the museum. They dragged rivers and searched abandoned buildings. They followed up on hundreds of tips from people who thought they'd seen a yellow school bus, people who thought they'd heard children crying, people who thought they knew what had happened to 19 kids from a place most of them had never heard of. They found nothing. No bus, no bodies, no evidence of what had happened or where. Bus 47 and everyone on it had simply ceased to exist somewhere between a fruit stand and their destination, leaving behind only questions and grief and the particular kind of horror that comes from children disappearing without explanation. The case consumed the investigators who worked it. Agent Patricia Voss from the FBI spent 3 years assigned almost exclusively to the Millbrook case, following leads that went nowhere, interviewing witnesses who'd seen nothing useful, mapping and remapping possible routes and scenarios and explanations that never quite made sense. Agent Voss had been with the FBI for 12 years when she was assigned to Millbrook. She'd worked kidnapping cases, child exploitation cases, organized crime cases that kept her awake at night wondering about the darkness humans were capable of creating. But the Millbrook case was different. There was no evidence of human evil, just absence, as if the bus and everyone on it had been erased from reality itself. "I've worked cases where children died," she told her supervisor after 18 months of investigation. "This isn't that. This is something else. This is children who stopped existing." The search officially ended after 2 years, though Agent Voss continued working the case unofficially until she retired in 2003. The files were transferred to the State Bureau of Investigation, where they sat in boxes marked "cold case" and gathered dust while other emergencies demanded attention. The families never stopped searching. Tommy Brennan's mother drove mountain roads every weekend for 7 years looking for some sign of her son, a piece of his backpack, a fragment of the yellow bus, anything that would tell her what had happened to her boy who'd loved dinosaurs and worried about everything and kept his inhaler in his front pocket because she'd taught him to be prepared. Cassie Morrison's father mortgaged his house to hire private investigators who found nothing but charged him money he didn't have for hope he couldn't afford. Marcus Webb's grandmother sat on her front porch every afternoon until she died in 2008. Watching the road as if she expected to see her grandson walking home from school, 15 years late, but smiling in the way that had made adults forget he was a child. Little Beth Carlisle's parents divorced in 1997. Her mother moved to Arizona, saying she couldn't live in a place where her daughter had vanished into nothing. Her father stayed in Millbrook, in the house where Beth's bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it on September 23, 1994, stuffed animals on the bed, school clothes in the closet, a half-finished puzzle on the floor that he couldn't bring himself to complete or put away. Mrs. Hartley's husband had died 3 years before the field trip, but she had sisters, parents, a life that extended beyond the classroom. After the disappearance, that life contracted until it contained only the absence of 19 children whose names she'd written in her careful, cursive handwriting, whose birthday parties she'd attended, whose scraped knees she'd bandaged, whose fears about multiplication tables and monster movies she'd helped them overcome. She never taught again. She couldn't enter a classroom without seeing empty desks, without hearing voices that weren't there, without feeling responsible for something she couldn't name or understand or fix. Ray Kowalski left behind a brother who'd served in Vietnam and understood something about men who disappeared into circumstances beyond their control. The brother kept Ray's trailer exactly as it was for 5 years, maintaining the small vegetable garden, paying the lot rent, as if Ray might come back and need somewhere to live. But Ray Kowalski never came back. None of them did. 29 years passed, the families aged and scattered. Some moved away from Millbrook, unable to live with the daily reminder of loss. Others stayed, anchored by the hope that their children might someday return, might appear walking down a familiar road as if no time had passed at all. The case files grew thicker with tips that led nowhere, theories that explained nothing, false confessions from people who wanted to be important or notorious or simply connected to something that had captured the world's attention. Every few years, a new investigator would review the files, search the same locations, interview the same witnesses, and reach the same conclusion. 19 children and 2 adults had vanished without a trace, and no amount of investigation could explain how or why. Millbrook Elementary closed in 2010, a victim of declining enrollment and budget cuts. The building was sold to the county and converted into a community center, though most locals avoided the place. Too many memories lived in those hallways, not just of the children who'd disappeared, but of the children who'd grown up and moved away, leaving behind a community that felt haunted by its own past. The playground equipment was removed. The classrooms were repurposed as meeting rooms and storage spaces. Mrs. Hartley's blackboard was painted over, but sometimes in certain light, you could still see the faint impression of words she'd written in chalk. Math problems and reading assignments in the schedule for September 23, 1994, that had ended with an expected return time that never came. By 2023, most of the original investigators had retired or died. Agent Voss passed away in 2019, taking with her 3 decades of theories about what might have happened to Bus 47. The case existed primarily in online forums where amateur detectives debated possibilities and shared photographs of yellow school buses they thought might be connected to the disappearance. The parents were grandparents now, or gone entirely. Tommy Brennan's mother had died in 2015, never knowing what happened to her son. Cassie Morrison's father had remarried and moved to Florida, leaving behind the house where he'd waited for a red-haired girl who never came home. Marcus Webb's grandmother's house on Sycamore Street was occupied by strangers who knew nothing about the serious-eyed boy who'd helped tend the garden behind their kitchen window. Millbrook County had moved on as communities do. New families arrived, children who'd never heard of the field trip that never returned. The story became local legend, the kind of tale that parents told to keep their own children close, that teenagers repeated at slumber parties to frighten each other, that gradually transformed from tragedy into folklore. Until March 15, 2023, when everything changed. The construction crew from Piedmont Development
had been hired to clear 50 acres of what had been the old Hendricks farm for a shopping center that would bring chain restaurants and box stores to Millbrook County. The land had been empty since 2018 when the last Hendricks descendant died and left the property to a nephew in Charlotte, who wanted nothing to do with tobacco farming. On the morning of March 15, 2023, excavator operator Dale Crenshaw was breaking ground on the eastern section of the property, clearing what had been a fallow field for the better part of a decade. He'd been working construction for 23 years and had dug up plenty of unexpected things: old septic systems, forgotten wells, the occasional rusted car that someone had buried rather than haul to a junkyard. But when his bucket hit something solid 12 feet down and the impact rang through the machine like a bell, Dale knew he'd found something different. Felt like metal, he told investigators later. Big metal. Bigger than a car, but not as big as a house. Something right in between. He'd called his foreman, Bobby Reeves, who'd climbed down into the hole to see what Dale had uncovered. The first thing visible was a patch of yellow paint, scratched and faded but unmistakably the color of a school bus. The second thing was a set of numbers stenciled in black paint. 47. Bobby Reeves had lived in Millbrook County his entire life. He was 7 years old in 1994, too young to remember the details, but old enough to remember the helicopters, the news vans, the way adults had whispered and looked over their shoulders for months after the disappearance. He knew what they'd found before they'd excavated another inch. The county sheriff arrived within an hour. The state police arrived 2 hours after that. By afternoon, the construction site had been transformed into a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape and surrounded by vehicles marked with the logos of agencies that hadn't worked together since 1994. Dr. Sarah Kim, the state's chief medical examiner, arrived that evening and worked by floodlights as they carefully excavated around the bus. What they found defied every assumption investigators had made about the Millbrook disappearance. Bus 47 sat upright in what appeared to be a carefully constructed underground chamber. The walls around it were lined with concrete blocks, professionally installed, with a drainage system that had kept the space dry for nearly 3 decades. This wasn't a grave or an accident, it was a tomb, built with precision and maintained with care. The bus itself showed no signs of crash damage. The windows were intact, the tires were properly inflated. The engine compartment was clean and organized, as if someone had serviced the vehicle regularly even after burying it 12 feet underground. But it was the windows that made Dr. Kim stop and stare, that made seasoned investigators step back and wonder if they were seeing correctly. Every window of Bus 47 was covered with hash marks, thousands upon thousands of them carved methodically into the glass from the inside. They covered every available surface: the windows, the emergency exits, even the small windows near the ceiling. The marks were organized in groups of 5, the way prisoners mark days on cell walls, the way people count when they're waiting for something that might never come. Dr. Kim had examined crime scenes for 18 years. She'd seen evidence of prolonged captivity, torture, psychological breakdown, but she'd never seen anything like the methodical precision of these marks, covering every inch of glass with the patience of people who had nothing but time. Inside the bus, they found what remained of 19 children, 1 teacher, and 1 bus driver. Each body was in its original seat, held in place by seat belts that had been carefully fastened post-mortem. The bodies showed no signs of trauma, no evidence of violence or struggle. They appeared to have died peacefully, perhaps from carbon monoxide poisoning or some other method that left no visible marks on bone. But the arrangement was deliberate, ceremonial. Someone had taken care to position each body properly to ensure dignity even in death. Mrs. Hartley sat in her usual spot, 3rd row back on the right side. Tommy Brennan was in the front where he could breathe easier. Little Beth Carlisle had been placed near the emergency exit, as if even in death she was seeking an escape route. The bus had been equipped with modifications that hadn't existed in 1994. Solar panels were mounted on the roof, connected to a battery system that powered LED lights throughout the interior. Ventilation fans had been installed to circulate air.
A water filtration system was connected to the drainage that kept the underground chamber dry. Someone had built this tomb to sustain life, not just contain death. Dr. Kim's preliminary examination suggested the victims had been alive in this underground chamber for a significant period. Weeks, possibly months. The hash marks on the windows told part of the story, organized counting that suggested people trying to track time in a place where day and night had no meaning. But forensic analysis of the marks revealed something that made investigators question everything they thought they understood about the case. The cuts in the glass showed tool marks from at least 6 different implements. Pocket knives, car keys, belt buckles, anything sharp enough to scratch glass. This wasn't the work of one person losing their mind in captivity. This was collaborative counting, a group effort to maintain some sense of time's passage in a place designed to erase it. More disturbing still, the marks continued for approximately 4 months after the disappearance, then stopped abruptly. For 4 months, the victims of the Millbrook disappearance had been alive, 12 feet underground, carving days into windows while the world above searched for them in all the wrong places. The question that haunted investigators was simple: who had done this and why? The answer came from an unexpected source, a confession letter found in a safety deposit box in Charlotte, North Carolina, registered to Leonard Hendricks, the nephew who'd inherited the farm property and sold it to developers. Leonard Hendricks had died of pancreatic cancer on February 8, 2023, exactly 5 weeks before the construction crew uncovered Bus 47. His final act before entering hospice care had been to visit his bank and update the contents of his safety deposit box, leaving behind a handwritten confession that explained 29 years of mystery in 12 pages of careful, cursive handwriting. Hendricks had been 31 years old in 1994, unemployed, living in a trailer on his uncle's farm property while supposedly helping with tobacco harvesting. He was a veteran of the Gulf War with an engineering degree he'd never used and a grudge against a world that he felt had forgotten him after his service ended. According to his confession, the plan had never been to hurt anyone. He'd spent months watching the school bus route, timing its passage through the valley, noting that it traveled a stretch of isolated road where it wouldn't be seen for miles. His original intention had been to steal the bus, sell it for parts maybe, or just prove to himself that he was capable of taking something valuable without being caught. But when he'd flagged down Bus 47 on September 23, 1994, claiming his truck had broken down and asking Ray Kowalski for help, he'd seen the children's faces in the windows and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I couldn't let them go," he wrote in his confession. "They'd seen me. They knew what I looked like. If I took the bus and left them on the road, they'd tell people who I was. I'd go to prison for theft, maybe kidnapping. I'd spent 2 years in the desert fighting a war nobody cared about, and I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life in a cell because some kids saw me steal a school bus." What Hendricks had done next defied understanding. Instead of abandoning his plan or finding another solution, he'd forced Ray Kowalski at gunpoint to drive to the farm property, where he'd prepared a solution that was both elaborate and insane. For 6 months before the kidnapping, Hendricks had been excavating an underground chamber using equipment borrowed from construction sites around the county. He'd built what he described in his confession as a place where they could live until I figured out what to do next. A concrete-lined space with ventilation, lighting, and water systems designed to sustain human life indefinitely. His plan, as much as it qualified as a plan, had been to keep the bus and its passengers underground until the search ended and public attention moved elsewhere. Then he would release them, perhaps in another state, and disappear himself before anyone could connect him to their disappearance. "I wasn't a killer," he wrote. "I never wanted to hurt kids. I just needed them to not exist for a while until it was safe for me to let them exist again." But keeping 21 people alive in an underground chamber had proved more complicated than Hendricks had anticipated. The psychological pressure on the victims had been enormous. Mrs. Hartley had tried to maintain normalcy, organizing activities and lessons to keep the children's minds occupied. She'd led them in singing songs and reciting multiplication tables and telling stories about what they would do when they went home. But as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, even Mrs. Hartley's strength had begun to fail. The children had grown listless, then despondent, then something beyond despair, a kind of hollow acceptance that this underground world was all they would ever know. Hendricks had visited them daily, bringing food and supplies and promises that their captivity would end soon. He'd installed the hash marking system himself, giving them tools to track time as a way to maintain their sanity. But the counting had become obsessive, compulsive, a shared ritual that bound the victims together in their understanding that each mark represented another day stolen from their lives. The confession detailed the psychological deterioration of both the captives and their captor. Hendricks had found himself trapped by his own elaborate plan, unable to release his prisoners without guaranteeing his own capture, unable to kill them because he genuinely hadn't wanted to hurt children, unable to continue maintaining their underground existence indefinitely. Mrs. Hartley asked me every day when we were going home, he wrote. I told her soon, always soon. But soon never came, and after a while she stopped asking. That's when I knew I'd broken something that couldn't be fixed. The end had come in January 1995, 4 months after the kidnapping. A winter storm had damaged the ventilation system, and carbon monoxide from the generator he'd been using to power the underground chamber had leaked into the space where his captives slept. Hendricks had found them on the morning of January 18, 1995. All 21 victims dead in their seats, peaceful and still, as if they'd simply gone to sleep and chosen not to wake up. His confession described the hours he'd spent in that underground tomb, looking at the bodies of people whose only crime had been riding a school bus past his property on a September morning. He'd considered calling police, considered confessing, considered killing himself to join them in whatever comes after this life ends. Instead, he'd sealed the chamber and spent the next 28 years living with the knowledge of what he'd done. He'd moved to Charlotte, found work as a mechanic, married a woman who never learned about his past. He'd lived a quiet life punctuated by nightmares and the constant fear that someday someone would discover his secret. I dreamed about them every night for 28 years, his confession concluded. Mrs. Hartley reading stories to children who would never grow up, Tommy Brennan asking about dinosaurs he'd never see, little Beth climbing toward windows she'd never reach. I'd wake up counting hash marks in my head, trying to remember what number we'd reached before the counting stopped. I'm dying now, and that should feel like punishment, but it doesn't. It feels like relief. The only punishment that ever mattered was living with what I'd done, and that punishment is finally ending. I hope their families can find some peace in knowing the truth. I hope the children are somewhere better than the place I kept them. I hope Mrs. Hartley has forgiven me, though I know I don't deserve forgiveness. Their bodies are 12 feet under the east field of the old Hendricks farm. I've been paying the property taxes to make sure nobody disturbed them. Now that I'm gone, they should be found soon. They should go home. The confession was signed Leonard William Hendricks and dated February 1st, 2023, a week before his death. Dr. Kim's forensic examination confirmed the details in Hendricks' confession. The victims had died from carbon monoxide poisoning peacefully and without suffering. The hash marks on the windows numbered 2,847, exactly 4 months and 3 days, matching Hendricks' timeline precisely. Among the personal effects found with the bodies was Mrs. Hartley's field trip clipboard, still containing the list she'd made of her 19 students with their individual notes. The paper had deteriorated over nearly 3 decades, but the ink remained legible. Tommy Brennan, remember his inhaler, Cassie Morrison, gets carsick, cedar up front Marcus Webb, packed lunch, peanut allergy Little Beth Carlisle, afraid of elevators, use stairs asterisk beside each child's name. Mrs. Hartley had made additional notes in different colored pens, apparently added during their months of captivity. Tommy, still asking about dinosaurs, brave boy Cassie, helping with younger children, so patient Marcus, keeping everyone's spirits up, natural leader Little Beth, drawing pictures of home on the walls. Even in the worst circumstances imaginable, Eleanor Hartley had remained a teacher, noting her students' growth and character and the small daily miracles that define childhood even in darkness. The bodies were removed from Bus 47 with ceremony and dignity. 19 families, or what remained of them after 29 years, finally had answers and closure. They could stop searching empty roads and following false leads and wondering if their children were alive somewhere waiting to be found. The funerals were held on a Saturday in May, in the Methodist cemetery where Brennans and Morrisons and Webbs and Carlyles had been buried for more than a century. The graves were marked with headstones that gave birth dates from the 1980s and death dates from 1995, spanning the months when 21 people had existed in a space between life and death that had no name. Mrs. Hartley was buried beside the husband she'd lost 3 years before the field trip. Her headstone read simply, Eleanor May Hartley, 1952 to 1995, beloved teacher. Parents who'd grown old, waiting for news they didn't want to hear, stood beside fresh graves and remembered a woman who'd loved their children as her own, who died protecting them even when protection was impossible. Ray Kowalski was buried in the veterans section of the cemetery. His grave marked with a flag and a headstone that acknowledged his service in Korea and his death in the line of duty. Because driving a school bus is always the line of duty when children's lives depend on your care and competence. Tommy Brennan's mother hadn't lived to see her son buried, but his father attended the funeral carrying a toy dinosaur his son had left on his bedroom dresser 29 years earlier. Marcus Webb's grandmother's house had new occupants, but her church family came to represent the boy she'd raised in the garden he'd helped her tend behind the house on Sycamore Street. Little Beth Carlyle's parents had divorced decades earlier, but they stood together beside their daughter's grave. Two people whose lives had been shattered by loss, finally able to grieve properly for the small. Fearless girl who'd loved exploring underground places and had died in one that was never meant for children. The discovery of Bus 47 answered the questions that had haunted Millbrook County for nearly 3 decades, but it created new questions that had no answers. How does a community process the knowledge that its children died not from accident or evil intention, but from one man's inability to see past his own problems to the human cost of his actions? Leonard Hendricks had been buried quietly in Charlotte 3 weeks before Bus 47 was discovered. His grave was unmarked, his funeral attended only by his widow and the minister who'd been paid to say words over a man whose story was still unknown. When news of the confession broke, his widow requested that his body be moved to an undisclosed location. The cemetery complied without question. There were no protests, no vandalism, no calls for revenge against a dead man who'd finally told the truth about what he'd done. Millbrook County was too tired for anger, too relieved by answers to waste energy on rage that couldn't change anything. But the questions remained. How do you forgive someone who kidnapped children not from malice but from selfishness? How do you process evil that came not from hatred but from a man's inability to see past his own convenience to the lives he was destroying? Agent Patricia Voss had been dead for 4 years when Bus 47 was found, but her successor at the FBI reviewed her files and found a note she'd written in 2002, 8 years into the investigation. The Millbrook case haunts investigators because we assume evil has motivation that makes sense to evil people. We look for sexual predators, for ransom demands, for revenge against institutions or individuals. We don't know how to investigate disappearances that result from someone's casual decision to make other people not exist because their existence was inconvenient. If the Millbrook children are dead, and I believe they are, they probably died because someone needed them to not be somewhere at a particular time. The crime wasn't against them personally. It was against the idea that other people's lives matter as much as your own problems. That kind of evil is harder to solve because it doesn't follow patterns. It's arbitrary. An arbitrary evil is the kind that keeps investigators awake at night because it could happen to anyone, committed by anyone, for reasons that make sense only to the person who refuses to see other people as fully human. I hope I'm wrong. I hope these children are alive somewhere. But if they're not, I hope whoever took them understands that 19 8 to 9 and 10-year-olds were worth more than whatever problem their existence caused him. I don't think he does understand that. I think that's why we'll never find them. Patricia Voss had been wrong about never finding them, but right about everything else. The Hendricks Farm property was never developed. Piedmont Development donated the land to Millbrook County with the stipulation that it remain undeveloped in perpetuity. A small memorial was built on the site where Bus 47 had been buried. 19 white stones arranged in a circle around a larger stone marked with Eleanor Hartley's name and Ray Kowalski's name, surrounded by trees that would grow tall enough to shade the place where 21 people had spent their final months counting days on windows 12 feet underground. The memorial was dedicated on September 23, 2023, exactly 29 years after the field trip that never returned home. Families came, and former classmates who were now adults with children of their own, and teachers who'd worked at Millbrook Elementary when it was still a school full of children instead of a community center full of memories. Someone had planted a small garden near the memorial, flowers that would bloom in spring when children should be taking field trips, vegetables that would grow through summer when playgrounds should echo with voices of kids who were home from school and free to explore the world beyond their own backyards. The garden was tended by volunteers whose names were never published, people who came quietly to plant and water and weed around the stones that marked the place where childhood had ended for 19 families, and innocence had ended for a community that learned too late that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and hatred. Sometimes evil wears the face of a man who convinces himself that other people's lives matter less than his own problems. Sometimes it looks like ordinary selfishness taken to its logical conclusion. Sometimes it's as simple as someone deciding that making children disappear is easier than dealing with the consequences of his own actions. The hash marks that covered every window of Bus 47 were preserved as evidence, photographed and cataloged and stored in files that would outlive everyone who remembered the case. But their real meaning couldn't be captured by forensic photography or criminal investigation. Those marks were the record of 21 people refusing to let time pass without witness, refusing to let their days disappear without acknowledgement, refusing to stop being human even when someone had decided their humanity was inconvenient. Each mark was an act of resistance against a man who tried to make them not exist. Each group of 5 scratched into glass was proof that they had existed, that they'd counted days and hoped for rescue and maintained their dignity even when dignity was all they had left. Mrs. Hartley had taught her students to count to 100, to multiply and divide, to understand that numbers had meaning and order and purpose. In their final months, those 19 children had used numbers to prove they were still alive, still learning, still being taught by a teacher who'd never stopped believing they would somehow someday go home. They did go home, eventually. Not to the houses where they'd left bicycles in front yards and homework on kitchen tables, not to the families who'd grown old waiting for them to walk through doors that stayed closed for 29 years. But they went home to the place where all children belong, to the memory of people who loved them, to graves marked with their names, to a community that had never stopped searching and never stopped hoping and never stopped believing that 19, 8, 9, and 10-year-olds mattered more than one man's inability to see past his own problems. On clear September mornings, when the light slants across the mountains the way it did on the day Bus 47 left Millbrook Elementary for the last time, visitors to the memorial sometimes report hearing something that might be children's voices, counting in unison, keeping track of time in a place where time finally doesn't matter anymore.